The patient in room 303. The rain fell in heavy sheets, hammering against the windows of St. Mercy's Hospital. The old brick building stood at the edge of town, isolated by a stretch of dead trees and empty parking lots. Its tall, gray walls loomed under the flickering streetlights, and its many windows, some dark, others dimly glowing, resembled tired, watching eyes. James Morgan gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled the car into the hospital's lot. His wife, Evelyn, sat beside him, chewing her lip, while in the back seat, their 12-year-old son Daniel stared at the hospital with wide, uneasy eyes. "Do we have to go inside?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James turned in his seat to face him. "Your grandmother is sick, Danny. We're here to see her." Daniel hesitated before nodding. He knew that was true, but something about the hospital unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. The family stepped out into the rain, pulling their coats tight against the wind. The glass doors of St. Mercy's slid open automatically as they approached, letting out a rush of stale, antiseptic air. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a cold, artificial glow over the empty lobby. A young nurse sat behind the front desk, tapping at a keyboard. She looked up as they approached, offering a polite but distant smile. "We're here to see Margaret Morgan," James said, brushing the rain from his jacket. The nurse's fingers hesitated on the keyboard. Her expression stiffened for just a second, so brief that James almost didn't notice it, before she spoke. "She was admitted earlier this evening," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "She's on the 3rd floor, in room 303. Evelyn shivered, though the hospital was warm. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing the way the nurse's eyes flickered toward the hallway behind her. The nurse hesitated. "No," she said quickly. "Not at all." She gestured to the elevators. "3rd floor, last room at the end of the hall." The Morgans turned toward the elevators, but as they walked away, Daniel heard the nurse murmur something under her breath. He couldn't be sure, but it sounded like, "Poor thing." The 3rd floor. The elevator ride was slow, the dim overhead light flickering slightly. When the doors opened, they stepped into a long, eerily quiet hallway. Unlike the lobby, the 3rd floor felt abandoned. The air was heavy, stale. The walls were lined with closed doors, each marked with a brass number, but no voices, no movement came from within. Evelyn wrapped an arm around Daniel's shoulders as they walked, their footsteps echoing against the tile. "Something doesn't feel right," she muttered under her breath. James didn't respond, but his jaw was tight. As they neared the last door on the right, the brass numbers gleamed under the flickering hallway light. 303. James reached for the handle. The metal was ice-cold beneath his fingers. The door creaked open. Room 303. Margaret Morgan lay in the hospital bed, her frail body barely visible beneath the white sheets. The machines beside her beeped softly, monitoring her slow, shallow breathing. The room smelled faintly of medicine, but beneath that, there was another scent, something damp, like old wood left out in the rain. James approached the bed. "Mom?" Margaret's eyelids fluttered. Then, suddenly, her eyes snapped open. She gasped sharply, her frail hands clutching at the sheets. Her gaze darted wildly around the room before settling on James. And then, her entire expression changed. Fear. "James," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." James frowned. "Mom, it's okay. It's just us." Margaret shook her head, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "You have to go," she whispered. "Before midnight." Evelyn stepped closer, concern flashing across her face. "Margaret, what are you talking about?" Margaret's breath hitched. She turned to Evelyn, then to Daniel, her eyes widening. "He's here," she breathed. Daniel stiffened. Who? But before she could answer, the lights flickered violently. The room plunged into darkness. Then, slam. The door shut on its own. The monitors beside the bed flickered wildly, the beeping growing erratic. The air turned suffocatingly cold. Then, in the pitch-black silence, a new sound emerged. A low, raspy breathing. Not from Margaret. Not from the Morgans. From the far corner of the room. A place where no one should have been standing. Daniel clutched his mother's arm, his voice trembling. Who's there? Silence. Then, the breathing came closer. Margaret let out a sudden, desperate sob. He never left, she whispered. The patient. He never left. The shadows in the room moved. And then, the lights flashed back on. The room was empty. Only the Morgans and Margaret remained. But something was different. Something had changed. The brass numbers on the door, once polished and bright, were now old and tarnished. The flowers in the vase beside the bed had withered completely. And the air smelled of something new. Decay. Margaret exhaled shakily. It's too late, she whispered. The Morgans turned to her in confusion. And that was when the knocking started. A slow, deliberate tap against the hospital door. Tap. 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 Something was outside. And it wanted in. The sterile hum of the hospital filled the silence, but the knocking continued. Tap. 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 It was slow. Deliberate. Coming from the other side of room 303's door. James turned toward it, his pulse pounding in his ears. Is there someone out there? He called. His voice, meant to be firm, wavered slightly. Silence. Then. Tap. Tap. Louder this time. Evelyn clutched Daniel protectively, her breath shaky. James, don't open it. But James was already moving. He took slow steps toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. Behind him, Margaret gasped sharply. No, she cried. Don't let him in. James froze. His fingers hovered over the handle. He turned back to his mother, his expression tight with confusion. Who? He asked. Margaret was trembling, her hands clutching at the thin hospital sheets. Her face had lost what little color remained. The man, she whispered. The patient. Daniel swallowed hard. Grandma, what patient? Margaret's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to them. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. The one they forgot about. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, the knocking stopped. For a brief moment, the Morgans thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. And then, the door handle twisted. Slowly. Deliberately. Something was trying to get in. James lunged forward, slamming his weight against the door before it could open. The handle jiggled violently against his back, like someone was furious on the other side. Then, silence. James didn't move. He barely breathed. And then he heard it. The breathing. Low. Ragged. Right on the other side of the door. Just inches away. James squeezed his eyes shut. His heart slammed against his ribs. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The air felt lighter. The tension eased, just slightly. And then, the hospital intercom crackled to life. A harsh, static noise filled the room. Then, through the distortion, a voice whispered. He's still here. And then, the intercom cut to silence. The story of room 303. The room felt colder now. The walls seemed to close in. Margaret was crying softly, whispering prayers under her breath. James stepped away from the door. His hands were shaking. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "tell me what's going on." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes hollow. "There was a patient in this room," she whispered. "Many years ago. But something happened. Something wrong." Evelyn sat beside her. "What do you mean?" Margaret swallowed hard. "The hospital doesn't talk about it. The nurses, some of them remember, but they won't say a word. But I heard them, James. I heard them whispering." She licked her dry lips and continued. "He was admitted here, years ago. A John Doe. No family. No history. He was sick, but not in a way the doctors understood. He talked about shadows, about voices no one else could hear. And then, one night..." She broke off, shuddering. Evelyn touched her arm gently. "Go on." Margaret's hands gripped the sheets tightly. "One night, he started screaming. The nurses found him clawing at his own face, saying something was inside the room with him." Daniel's small voice broke through the tense silence. "What happened to him?" Margaret's breathing grew shallow. "They found him the next morning. Dead." Evelyn gasped softly. "How?" Margaret's gaze lifted to meet hers. "He had been ripped apart. But there were no signs that anyone else had entered the room. The air in room 303 seemed to grow thicker. The walls pressed in. The overhead light flickered, casting shifting shadows across the floor." James ran a hand down his face. "So what? You think his ghost is haunting this room?" Margaret shook her head. "No, James. Not his ghost." She turned, her expression grim. "Something else." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel gripped his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "I want to go home." Evelyn nodded quickly. "James, we need to leave." James hesitated. He had always been a rational man, a man who didn't believe in ghosts or curses or evil lingering in places it shouldn't. But the air in the room was so heavy. And deep in his gut, something told him, Margaret was right. "All right," he said. "Let's." Then, the hospital intercom crackled again. A soft, distorted breathing filled the room. Then, a voice, deep and hoarse, whispered just two words. "Stay. Here." The lights went out. Margaret screamed. Daniel sobbed. Evelyn clutched her son. And then, the door opened. Slowly. Silently. And something stepped inside. The air was thick. Heavy. A silence so unnatural it pressed against their ears. Then, footsteps. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. Something had entered room 303. Daniel whimpered, clutching his mother's arm. Evelyn held him tightly, her own breath ragged. Margaret was sobbing, whispering prayers under her breath. James swallowed, his pulse pounding. "Who's there?" No response. But the footsteps continued. Each step sent a cold wave of dread through their bodies. Something, someone, was moving closer in the pitch-black room. Then, a low, rasping breath. Not from Margaret. Not from the Morgans. From the darkness. James reached for his phone, fumbling with shaking fingers. He turned on the flashlight. And the beam illuminated a figure. A man. Or what was left of one. The patient. He stood at the foot of Margaret's bed. Tall. Gaunt. Wrapped in a tattered hospital gown. His skin was ashen, stretched too tight over his bones. His lips were cracked, his eyes sunken, black pits that seemed to pull the light inward. His fingers, long, too long, curled at his sides, the nails jagged and blackened. And his face. His face was ruined. Deep gashes covered his cheeks and forehead, like he had clawed at his own skin. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing yellowed, broken teeth. And his eyes, his empty, black eyes, were staring directly at James. James staggered back, the phone shaking in his grip. Evelyn screamed. The figure moved. Not walked. Not stepped. Just appeared. Closer. James turned the flashlight toward the door, but it was gone. The door, the walls, even the hospital bed had vanished. The room was no longer a room. It was endless darkness. James's breath came fast and shallow. "What do you want?" he whispered. The patient tilted his head slowly, his neck cracking. Then, in a voice low and broken, he whispered, "You let me in." The lights exploded back on. The room was normal again. Margaret was in the bed, whimpering. Evelyn was holding Daniel, both of them shaking. And the patient was gone. But something felt different. Something had changed. James turned to Margaret. Her eyes were wide. Hollow. Unblinking. "Mom?" She exhaled shakily. "He's not gone," she whispered. James's blood ran cold. Then. A sound. A rhythmic, soft beeping. The monitor beside Margaret's bed. Only. It wasn't tracking her heartbeat. It was tracking something else. The rhythm was wrong. Too slow. Too deep. Like a pulse that didn't belong to her. Then, across the room. The mirror changed. The reflection of the Morgans was there. But so was something else. Behind them. A shadow. Growing. Stretching. Moving toward them. James turned, but there was nothing there. Only in the mirror. Then. The light flickered. And the shadow stepped out. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was him. The patient. Only this time. His mouth was open. And from the darkness within came a second voice. One that wasn't his. One that was layered. Hollow. Wrong. And it whispered. "Now you're mine." The room collapsed into darkness. The hospital room was quiet. Room 303 was empty. The Morgans were gone. The nurses refused to speak about that night. The security footage from 12 a.m. to 12:06 had mysteriously corrupted. And the room itself. The bed. The floor. The walls. Were stained black. Like something had been burned away. But the hospital records remained. The last patient to ever stay in room 303 was listed as Margaret Morgan. Admitted. Never discharged. Yet the bed was empty. And if anyone listened closely in the dead of night, they could still hear the sound of something tapping. Tap. 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 Waiting. For the next patient. The end.